In the summer of 1919, the United States stood at a crossroads it rarely acknowledges. While the nation celebrated victory abroad and spoke proudly of freedom and democracy, a different reality was unfolding at home. Across more than 36 American cities, coordinated racial violence erupted, reshaping communities, silencing voices, and leaving a deep scar on the country's history. This period would later be known as the Red Summer of 1919, a moment so consequential that it challenged the very meaning of justice in America, yet one that has been quietly pushed to the margins of public memory. This is not just a story about unrest. It is a story about returning soldiers who believed service would earn dignity, families who migrated north seeking opportunity, and communities that dared to hope for a better future. Instead, they were met with fear, resistance, and systems determined to preserve the old order. Streets that symbolized progress became battlegrounds for equality, and the promise of a new America was tested in ways few history books fully explore. Why is this chapter rarely discussed? Why were these events reframed, minimized, or forgotten altogether? And what happens when a nation chooses silence over truth? To understand the Red Summer is to understand how power, economics, media narratives, and institutional failures can collide, shaping generations long after the headlines fade. In this video, we will uncover the untold story behind the Red Summer of 1919, what led to it, what truly happened, and why its legacy still matters today. This is history that challenges comfort, demands reflection, and forces us to ask difficult questions about whose stories are remembered and whose are erased. If you believe history should be told fully and honestly, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories that history tried to bury. Let's begin. To understand how the Red Summer of 1919 erupted with such force, we must look beneath the surface of the violence and trace the currents that had been quietly building for years. The unrest did not appear suddenly, nor was it driven by a single event. It grew out of a fragile post-war America struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities, a nation exhausted by global conflict yet unwilling to confront the inequalities embedded within its own borders. When World War I ended, the United States welcomed home millions of soldiers and celebrated itself as a defender of freedom. Among those returning were African American veterans who had fought bravely overseas, many of them believing that their service would finally earn them the respect and equality long denied at home. They had worn the same uniforms, faced the same dangers, and carried the same hopes of a nation reborn. But when they stepped back onto American soil, they found that the world they left behind had not changed for them. The promises spoken in wartime speeches dissolved into familiar barriers, unspoken rules, and closed doors. For some, the disappointment cut deeper than the battlefield wounds they carried. At the same time, the country was undergoing a massive demographic shift. During and after the war, millions of African Americans left the rural South in what became known as the Great Migration. They traveled northward, drawn by the promise of industrial jobs, safer communities, and a chance to build lives beyond the constraints of the old plantation system. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and St. Louis transformed almost overnight, their black populations growing rapidly as new neighborhoods formed and old ones expanded. To many migrants, these cities represented hope and possibility, a chance to escape a past defined by rigid hierarchies and limited opportunity. Yet this movement also unsettled the existing social order. Northern cities were already strained by housing shortages, rising prices, and an economy struggling to adjust after the war. White workers, including returning veterans and recent immigrants, suddenly found themselves competing in a crowded labor market. Jobs that once seemed secure now felt uncertain, and resentment grew as fear took root. Instead of recognizing shared struggles, many were encouraged to see African American newcomers as rivals, symbols of a changing society they felt powerless to control. Economic pressure intensified these tensions. Employers often exploited the situation, using black labor to break strikes or fill positions vacated during labor disputes, deepening divisions between workers who might otherwise have found common ground. Neighborhoods became contested spaces, as segregated housing and discriminatory practices forced black families into overcrowded areas, while others sought to keep those boundaries firmly intact. Every new arrival, every promotion, every sign of progress was interpreted by some as a threat rather than a shared gain. Underlying all of this was an unresolved legacy of racism that the war had not erased but merely paused. Ideas about who belonged, who deserved opportunity, and who held authority had been shaped over generations, reinforced by institutions and cultural narratives that resisted change. In this climate, even small incidents could ignite larger conflicts, because they touched on fears and grievances that had long gone unaddressed. The nation's refusal to confront these deeper issues meant that tension accumulated like pressure behind a dam, waiting for a moment to break through. By the summer of 1919, those pressures converged. The hope inspired by wartime rhetoric collided with post-war realities. Migration reshaped cities faster than society could adapt, and economic uncertainty magnified old prejudices. The Red Summer was not simply a season of unrest. It was the consequence of choices made and conversations avoided, a reflection of a country struggling to define what freedom truly meant within its own borders. As tensions mounted in the wake of war, migration, and economic uncertainty, another powerful force shaped how Americans understood what was happening around them. This force did not operate in the streets alone but flowed through headlines, images, and official responses, quietly defining who was seen as a threat and who was seen as worthy of protection. The story of the Red Summer cannot be separated from the ideas that framed it, because perception itself became a weapon long before conflict erupted. At the heart of this climate was an ideology that insisted on preserving an unequal social order. It was reinforced not only through laws and customs, but through stories told repeatedly in newspapers, films, and public commentary. Much of the mainstream media of the era portrayed Black Americans through a narrow and distorted lens, often presenting them as dangerous, unruly, or inherently disruptive. These portrayals did not emerge by chance. They echoed long-standing stereotypes designed to stir fear and justify exclusion, especially at a moment when African American communities were becoming more visible, more organized, and more assertive in their demands for dignity. Sensational headlines and exaggerated reports transformed isolated incidents into sweeping narratives of disorder. Accusations were printed as fact, rumors were treated as evidence, and entire communities were judged through the actions of individuals, or sometimes through nothing more than suspicion. In this environment, fear spread faster than truth. Readers were encouraged to believe that social change itself was a threat, and that stability could only be preserved by forceful responses. These narratives reassured some that resistance to equality was not only acceptable, but necessary. Popular culture amplified these messages. Films and illustrations circulated images that framed black success or self-defense as danger, while portraying unequal power structures as natural and justified. Such imagery shaped public imagination, blurring the line between fiction and reality. Over time, these depictions hardened attitudes, making it easier for audiences to accept or overlook suffering when it occurred. When violence finally erupted, it was often explained away as a reaction rather than a wrongdoing, the result of provocation rather than prejudice. Institutions that were meant to uphold fairness were deeply influenced by this atmosphere. Law enforcement officers and local officials were not immune to the ideas surrounding them, and in many cases, their actions reflected the same assumptions found in the press. Reports from the period revealed patterns of selective enforcement, delayed responses, and misplaced blame. In some cities, those seeking safety found little reassurance from the authorities tasked with maintaining order. The absence of protection spoke as loudly as open hostility, signaling whose lives were prioritized and whose were considered expendable. Government silence further reinforced these dynamics. Federal leaders often hesitated to intervene decisively, wary of political consequences or reluctant to challenge local power structures. This lack of clear leadership allowed misinformation to flourish and emboldened those who believed their actions would carry no consequences. In a nation that claimed to stand for justice, the gap between principle and practice became painfully visible. Yet this was not a story told by one voice alone. Alongside the dominant narratives existed a determined effort to document reality more honestly. Black journalists and community leaders worked tirelessly to counter false portrayals, publishing first-hand accounts and challenging the stories that blamed victims for their own suffering. Their work provided an alternative record, one grounded in lived experience rather than fear-driven speculation. These publications reminded readers that what was unfolding was not chaos without cause, but the result of deeply rooted inequalities left unaddressed. By shaping public perception, media and institutions played a critical role in how the Red Summer unfolded and how it was remembered. Fear, once normalized, became justification, and silence became complicity. Understanding this dimension reveals that the violence was not only physical but narrative-driven, sustained by stories that framed inequality as order and injustice as necessity. It is within this landscape of ideas, as much as in the streets themselves, that the Red Summer took its most enduring form. By the time the Red Summer reached its most visible moments, the pressures that had been building across the nation began to concentrate into a series of devastating flashpoints. These were not isolated disturbances, but moments when long-standing tensions collided with fear, misinformation, and institutional failure, exposing how unevenly protection and justice were applied. In city streets and rural towns alike, the promise of equal treatment gave way to a reality shaped by power and neglect. In Chicago, the unrest unfolded in a city already strained by rapid growth and rigid segregation. Neighborhoods were sharply divided, and competition for housing and employment had created an uneasy balance that could easily be disrupted. When a single incident along the lakeshore ignited outrage, the response revealed how fragile that balance truly was. Violence spread through residential areas, businesses were destroyed, and families were driven from their homes. What stood out most was not only the scale of the destruction, but the uneven response meant to contain it. Many residents watched as protection failed to arrive, or arrived too late, reinforcing the sense that safety was not guaranteed for everyone. For those affected, the message was clear. The institutions meant to preserve order were either unwilling or unable to act impartially. The events in the nation's capital carried a different but equally troubling symbolism. Washington, D.C. was supposed to represent the authority of the federal government and the ideals it claimed to uphold. Yet the unrest there demonstrated that proximity to power did not translate into security. Fueled by alarming rumors and inflammatory reporting, groups moved through neighborhoods with a sense of confidence that suggested they would face little resistance. In response, Black residents organized to defend themselves, marking a departure from past expectations of passive endurance. This moment revealed both resilience and desperation, as communities realized that official protection could not be relied upon. Only after days of turmoil did federal forces intervene decisively, underscoring how slow and selective the response had been. While the violence in large cities drew national attention, the most devastating episode occurred far from the urban spotlight. In the rural town of Elaine, Arkansas, the conflict took on an even darker character. What began as an effort by Black agricultural workers to seek fair treatment quickly escalated into a widespread assault that engulfed the surrounding countryside. The response was swift and overwhelming, involving not only local forces but broader state and federal involvement. Entire communities were shattered, and the aftermath was marked by arrests and prosecutions that seemed detached from the realities of what had occurred. Justice, in this context, appeared less about truth and more about reinforcing an existing hierarchy. Across these flashpoints, a pattern emerged. Violence was met with inconsistent enforcement of the law, and accountability was unevenly applied. In many cases, those who suffered the greatest losses were also the ones most likely to be blamed or ignored. The contrast between the ideals of American democracy and the lived experience of these communities could not have been sharper. Each incident, whether in a major city or a small town, revealed how deeply ingrained biases shaped official decisions, determining whose safety mattered and whose voices would be dismissed. These events also reshaped how communities understood their place within the nation. The realization that protection was conditional forced many to reconsider their relationship with the state and its institutions. Trust eroded, replaced by a growing awareness that survival often depended on collective strength rather than official assurances. The flashpoints of the Red Summer thus became more than moments of crisis. They were turning points that exposed the consequences of neglect and inequality. Taken together, Chicago, Washington, and Elaine formed a grim map of a country struggling to confront itself. They showed that the Red Summer was not confined to one region or circumstance, but reflected a national failure to uphold justice consistently. In revealing how state power was applied unevenly, these moments left a legacy that would shape conversations about rights, protection, and accountability for generations to come. Among all the flashpoints of the Red Summer, none revealed the depth of injustice more starkly than what unfolded in Elaine, Arkansas. While cities like Chicago and Washington exposed failures in urban centers, Elaine showed how deeply unequal power could operate in rural America, far from national attention, where systems of control were firmly entrenched and rarely questioned. The events there were not sudden chaos, but the culmination of long-standing exploitation, meeting a moment of collective resolve. In the cotton fields of eastern Arkansas, black sharecroppers lived under an economic system that offered little chance of advancement. Bound by unfair contracts and crushing debt, many worked land they would never own, receiving wages that barely sustained their families. For years, this arrangement had gone largely unchallenged, reinforced by intimidation and the absence of legal protection. Yet the post-war period brought new awareness, inspired by broader movements for dignity and emboldened by the idea that rights could be claimed rather than requested. Some sharecroppers began to organize. Their goal was simple and measured: fair compensation for their labor and transparency in how their earnings were calculated. This effort alone was enough to unsettle the local power structure. Organization threatened a system built on silence and dependence, and the idea that black laborers might negotiate collectively was perceived as a challenge to authority itself. What followed transformed a labor dispute into a catastrophe. Fear-driven reactions escalated rapidly, and the response was overwhelming in its scale. Forces meant to preserve order instead reinforced imbalance, treating the call for fairness as an act of defiance that had to be crushed rather than addressed. As violence spread through the surrounding countryside, entire communities were uprooted, families fled their homes, livelihoods were destroyed, and the landscape itself bore the marks of upheaval. The imbalance of force made clear that this was not a conflict between equals, but a one-sided campaign to reassert control. When the turmoil subsided, the human cost was staggering, far exceeding what had occurred in other parts of the country during that summer. Yet even in the aftermath, the pattern of injustice continued. Survivors of the violence found themselves facing a legal system that offered little protection and even less understanding. Dozens were arrested, not for acts of wrongdoing, but for being associated with the very effort that had sought fair treatment. Court proceedings moved swiftly, stripped of meaningful safeguards, and verdicts appeared predetermined. These trials served less as a search for truth and more as a warning, reinforcing the consequences of challenging the existing order. In this moment, the law itself became another instrument of inequality. Years later, the story of Elaine reached a broader stage. The cases were eventually reviewed at the highest level, where the absence of due process could no longer be ignored. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn the convictions marked a rare acknowledgement that justice had failed profoundly. While the ruling could not undo the losses endured by the community, it established an important principle: that constitutional rights could not be suspended simply because those asserting them lacked power or influence. Within the larger narrative of the Red Summer, Elaine stands as its most devastating chapter, not only because of the scale of suffering, but because of what it revealed about the relationship between labor, race, and the state. It showed how demands for fairness could be recast as threats, and how swiftly authority could mobilize to preserve inequality when challenged. At the same time, it demonstrated the resilience of those who refused to abandon the idea that justice, however delayed, was still worth pursuing. The legacy of the Elaine massacre extends beyond its immediate aftermath. It exposed the fragility of rights when they depend on local discretion rather than universal enforcement, and it underscored why national scrutiny and legal accountability mattered. In doing so, Elaine became not just a tragedy, but a turning point, one that forced the nation, however reluctantly, to confront the consequences of allowing inequality to define the boundaries of justice. The Red Summer of 1919 did not end when the violence faded from the streets. Its most enduring impact unfolded quietly in the years that followed, shaping a new chapter in American history defined not only by loss, but by resolve. For many black communities, the events of that summer marked a painful realization that waiting for justice to arrive on its own was no longer an option. What emerged instead was a renewed determination to demand rights openly, to organize strategically, and to challenge systems that had long operated without accountability. Across the country, African Americans began to rethink how resistance could take shape. The expectation of passive endurance gave way to a broader understanding of self-advocacy and collective action. Community organizations grew stronger, networks expanded, and political awareness deepened. The violence of 1919 made clear that progress would not be linear or easily granted, but it also revealed the power of unity and persistence. Out of fear and disappointment came a sharpened sense of purpose. Civil rights advocacy entered a more organized and confrontational phase during this period, with groups like the NAACP playing a central role. Building on earlier efforts, the organization intensified its legal strategies, public campaigns, and documentation of injustice. By gathering evidence, amplifying suppressed voices, and challenging false narratives, these advocates reframed the national conversation. They insisted that racial violence was not a series of isolated events, but a systemic failure demanding federal attention and reform. Their work laid the intellectual and legal foundation for movements that would follow decades later. One of the most significant outcomes of this period was the emergence of legal precedents that expanded the meaning of constitutional protection. Cases arising from the Red Summer, particularly those connected to the Elaine massacre, forced the courts to confront the consequences of unequal justice. When the U.S. Supreme Court overturned unjust convictions and affirmed the importance of due process, it sent a message that rights could not be denied simply because of race or circumstance. These rulings did not erase injustice, but they established tools future generations would use to challenge it more effectively. Equally important was the shift in collective memory and identity. The Red Summer became a point of reckoning, even if it was not always acknowledged openly. It influenced writers, activists, and thinkers who understood that telling the truth about the past was essential to changing the future. The stories preserved by black journalists, historians, and families ensured that what happened in 1919 would not be completely erased, even when it was excluded from textbooks and official narratives. Today, the legacy of the Red Summer reminds us that progress is often born from moments of crisis. It shows how injustice can provoke not only suffering, but also transformation, and how the courage to confront uncomfortable truths can shape the path toward greater equality. Remembering this history is not about reopening old wounds, but about recognizing how hard-won many freedoms have been, and how vigilance remains necessary to protect them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on a chapter of history that deserves to be remembered. If you found this exploration meaningful and want to continue uncovering stories that shape the world we live in today, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we keep history alive through honest storytelling. Keep history alive through honest storytelling.